Welcome to Stand By Please.
With me, Antonia Collins from the Bamboo Manager Project.
And me, Jackie George from Sharjah Performing Arts Academy.
In this podcast, we talk all things stage management. Join us and our guests as we try to answer the question, what is your stage manager really thinking?
Hello, here we are again. Who'd have thought that we would get this far? People have enjoyed it, so we're just going to carry on.
And we've had conversations with friends and colleagues about things we haven't quite yet explored, or even revisiting areas that we might have talked about before, but still in our minds, still bothering us.
There's a lot of things still bothering me, Jackie. But, who knew when we started to talk about doing a podcast that 26 weeks later, because for those of you that have been paying attention, I am still turning down the pages of my diary every week.
The face of things is changing slowly and things are more relaxed and opening up. Dubai can now host events. So we're seeing all the event companies address how they start to safely stage those events, which is really exciting. I see that Dubai Opera has their autumn season online ready for booking. So things are starting to happen. Public confidence in going to those events and theatre performances, I'm not quite sure it's there yet. So it's going to be really interesting to see how well patronised those are. But very much still looking at, options for online learning and also the positives that we can draw from that online environment in training and in making work. There was a really interesting event that I attended last week, the Chinese Association of Performing Arts, and they were talking about how they can collaborate more with the Middle East. And now, certainly because of current times where we've been maybe slightly steered into that corner, we can have those conversations, which is good. What about yourself? Have you sort of found yourself more in an online world over the summer?
What I did do this summer, though, is I stage managed a musical on Zoom. It was kind of a fascinating experience, a fascinating experiment. Let's go with it like that. Because I hadn't done it before. I'm not the most IT savvy. I mean, I do okay, but I love having an ASM who can do some of those things for me. You've got to be self-reliant because otherwise you're not going to make it happen. And I, had an emergency hotline to another stage manager I knew who'd done quite a lot of work on Zoom already. And I was texting her saying, how do I do this now? What do I do? And certainly a massive difference between working on the basic Zoom account and the pro account. But I thought we could pick up on some of the things that weren't maybe the practical elements of working on Zoom, but more the psychological part of working on Zoom, because that's the area of stage management that you and I are particularly interested in. I do possibly have some practical things to say as well. I did make some notes. I think for me, yes, of course you could do it. Of course you could do it. I sent out the call every day. We had a new Zoom link every day. People came onto the Zoom, we rehearsed it, and then we were actually making a film, so we were then recording it. But the practical element wasn't that different in some ways. I mean, apart from the fact that the commute to work was really, much smaller than it's ever been. But actually, it was the psychology of it that was really the most interesting for me.
What do you feel are the benefits or disadvantages of working on Zoom then? What do you miss out on from that remote environment when you're rehearsing?
I don't think there are any benefits from a psychological perspective. I might change my mind by the time we get to the end of this conversation, but let's see how we go. Each person is just in their own location. Mm-hmm. So, certainly from a practical point of view, where you're doing this work from and how you're doing it makes a real difference, I think. And there's no escape from it. You are literally in your own home. Mm-hmm. There is nowhere else to go. From a practical point of view, I had 2 laptops on the go, so that kind of really helped. And like I say, I don't think the actual process of rehearsing was that different, but I was rehearsing with a very younger company, I mean adults, but at the start of their careers. Mm-hmm. And what I really, really missed was the support that I would normally be able to offer them away from rehearsal. we were working with a director who, when he listens to this, will be like, yeah, thanks for that, Antonia. But he doesn't give a lot. You know, he's not a very exuberant, is that the word? You know, his facial expressions don't really tell you very much about what he's thinking. And so I think for the young performers, that's quite difficult sometimes. And when I've worked with him with young performers before, the ability to be in a different space, in a lobby, in a foyer, in a green room, and for them to be able to ask me questions and to say things like, does he, you know, what's happening, Antonia? Are we doing all right? What, you know, those kind of things. We couldn't really do any of that. It didn't really exist. So to me, it felt like a huge part of my job, where I support the performer, was actually really difficult. And we did do some of it via WhatsApp. Some of them did reach out to me, and that was fine. That was fine. But it's just not the same. It's just not the same.
It's not. I think the major things I've struggled with, and this is not necessarily about rehearsing online, but the problems are similar in that they transfer to an online rehearsal or an online live performance and working remotely, is that, like you were saying, the boundaries get blurred. But the other thing I find really interesting, and what you touched upon, is that I think as stage managers, and good stage managers are really well versed in picking up on body language and those nuances of body language. And it's something I think we do second nature, because we are such social creatures. We can tell if people are listening, if they're engaged. I'm sure we've all been on Zooms where you're like, oh, they're blatantly checking an email or typing something else whilst I'm saying this really important point from my perspective. But you are one step removed, and that you can't always pick up on those nuances, and people are maybe one step removed. So I find that really difficult. And as much as a company stage manager, as much as I loathed booking the company meal and arranging those social aspects, I think that online platform of rehearsing and of live streaming or making a recorded show, where you don't have that social aspect, you do lose that company solidarity and team building, for all those sort of cheesy words and metaphors, but it is important.
I totally missed the sidebars, for want of a different, you know, for want of a term. You know, I missed the going to walk to buy some lunch with the director so that we could carry on talking. And yes, maybe that's messy. Maybe work shouldn't be like that, but it is part of our work, you know. And the call's at 10 and you arrive at the rehearsal room at 9:30, and then the director arrives at maybe, you know, 9:40, and then you have 10 minutes together where you talk about any tricky things or little corners or things. You totally lost that. We totally lost that on Zoom. So what tended to happen for us was we would start every rehearsal late, because every rehearsal would start with me and the director just on our own, and with all the company in the waiting room, because we were trying to play catch up with other things we needed to know about. And then we would stay on after the end of the rehearsal as well, just talking. Totally kind of blurry and messy. I'm not complaining about the blurry and messy. I don't mind that. We did use the breakout rooms on Zoom. We did. And that was kind of useful. And somebody else I know used the breakout rooms as like a green room. But one of the things I didn't like about it was that me as the host, the only way I could see in the breakout room was by going to the breakout room. Yeah, I totally missed that kind of being able to pick up the cues.
You can gauge that, absolutely. You can gauge that, can't you? Like if you walk into the green room and there's that sort of annoyed, awkward silence, you're like, right, okay, talk to me. What's the problem? Or if they're all really jolly and you can be like, yeah, happy company, I'm fine, I'm good to go. So if somebody's coming into the breakout room, you know they're coming because, you know, it pops up, so-and-so's entering, etc. So you miss out on reading, again, those subtleties, those atmospheres that you lose in that two-dimensional world. Oh, I was thinking, a name popped to mind. We both know a production manager who is the perfect example of getting most of his information and work done by having those conversations. So David Filshie, I'm going to name him, he is a production manager who absolutely relies on those drop-ins and those conversations and those passing moments to find out what's happening, what's going on in the building, and that's how he works effectively. And I think certainly it's case in point that you can't do that on Zoom, and you lose those as efficient and as effective as we are at working from home. And I know there's loads of tech companies out there, and Silicon Valley are like, yeah, absolutely, we're switching to online, nobody's coming, we're not going to have an office, or whatever it may be. That you lose those incidental, making a coffee in the kitchen, walk into the water cooler, or whatever it may be, and it all becomes either an official email. It's like a text, isn't it? You know, I've had conversations with people about how a text is read differently, and certainly I've had conversations with people who go, oh, well, I thought they meant that in that text, and I'm like, well, I didn't get that. Either I'm completely misreading it, or somebody sent you something in capitals. And again, it's so hard to read it whether it's an email or a WhatsApp, whereas if you're in the room. But again, it's that two-dimensional world. It's really hard to get a gauge unless people are completely honest and open with you.
I always say to people, write every email, every WhatsApp message, every text message like it could be read in court. So, you know, because that's always like a good benchmark, really. And you can say things in person that you wouldn't put in an email.
Absolutely.
And certainly when I teach stage management, I say to stage managers, move off the seat and walk around and go and see people. And especially in drama schools where you've got the workshop, the costume shop, and they're all on site together. And you'd say to a student stage manager, so what does that table, what's it like? And they'd be like, I don't know. And you'd be like, have you been to see it? Do you know, is it really heavy? Does it do the things you need it to do? And actually those are the moments where you really have dialogue with people that are also your co-creators in the project. And you know, how many times have I wandered into costume and told, you know, the costume supervisor some little bit of intel that I thought they should know about a performer or about a costume. You know, it doesn't need to be broadcast to the world. It's not a bit of information that everybody needs to know, but that costume supervisor who's about to do that fitting with that person kind of needs to know that, you know, they're not having a great day, or whatever it might be. And those kind of things are really difficult to mirror, to mimic over Zoom, over WhatsApp, whatever. That ability to actually go and see for yourself what the things are like. I mean, I'm not proud, but I did all the propping on Amazon. I know we're not meant to be using them ethically, but I needed doubles of stuff. Yeah. Because of course, if it's in one shot, then it's with another character in the same shot and they're in a different location, I need doubles of things. And of course, the fastest way to buy doubles of things is to buy it on Amazon Prime and to send it to them. But we bought all sorts of things that I never saw. That was the other thing. My job is to support performers so that they can do the best performers they can manage. That's how I see stage management, right? And I've got these 7 young performers totally on their own in their bedrooms trying to film themselves with a musical, with a ton of stuff I've sent them from Amazon, and me trying to explain to them via Zoom how something works or how to do it. And I just felt, I said to the director, it feels like I'm trying to do my job with my hands tied behind my back.
And I think that's one major thing I've learned from whether it's teaching remotely or rehearsing remotely online, is that, you know, what takes half an hour in a studio, give it an hour on Zoom. Everything takes much longer, which is fine if that's the world we're in, but we have to take that into account when scheduling rehearsals, etc. In one of the previous episodes, we touched upon it, but something I'd like to explore further is production values within Zoom performances, whether that's digitally recorded, whether that's live, but it's the production values and how we manage that. And teams as well. So for example, you did this musical, you were a single stage manager on this show. If that were in the real world and we were physical people in a physical room, how big would your team have been?
It would have been me, a DSM, and certainly at least 2 ASMs, I would have said.
Okay.
And there was definite times I considered paying somebody else. I considered paying, one of my ASM guys to do some of the propping for me, because I was literally running out of time at one point. And I was in a part of a group that were making 5 films, and so there were 4 other stage managers, but apart from a tiny bit of our projects were all totally independent.
Mm-hmm.
So ironically, 2 of us needed a pregnancy belly, so we did have a little dialogue about pregnancies, but otherwise you were kind of on your own. But it's interesting you say about production values, because at the beginning of the process, the director and I talked very early on that we were letting things go, in inverted commas, that normally we wouldn't have done. And he was talking about it from a directorial point of view, because, when you're in rehearsal and you're working with a performer and maybe it's a really difficult scene, well, then you'd be probably in a closed rehearsal room with director, DSM, and the performer, and you could really unpack something and dig into it. Forget that. We never even went there. It was very, I'm going to say, light touch. I don't think I'm insulting anybody, but I think it was because you can't deal with the fallout. We've all been there in a rehearsal room where maybe, not through anything problematic, not through anything nasty, but maybe a performer has touched on something that really resonates with them and they've had a very emotional response. Well, that's okay in real life. In real life, you can be like, oh, shall we have a little tea break? Do you want a cup of tea? Shall we get some, and we'll all sort of sit and talk about it. That's fine. But on Zoom, that just feels totally wrong. It feels wrong to ask a performer to go there when they're totally and utterly on their own most of the time. We didn't know whether they had anybody else to talk to after work.
Especially where, there's certain people who are more removed from social situations, their support networks, if they're not in a bubble. So what you'd expect them maybe to have at home, if they can touch base with friends or people outside of that project, they might not be able to do that in current circumstances whilst we're not in lockdown. People keep on saying we're not in lockdown. We're in some sort of middle world, aren't we?
Maybe we need to kind of think about it in a more specialised way, as opposed to I've got 3 people all the time. Yes. Because actually there would have been plenty of time when that second person wasn't really doing anything at all. But I have just thought of another positive of working in this way.
Yes.
Which isn't a wholly practical thing. So sort of fits the remit. Because I'm a CSM, of course, I never get to do table work, character analysis. And oh, what a joy. So for the first 2 weeks of rehearsal, we unpacked the text. And I'd forgotten just how lovely that is to be able to do that, because I never get to do that anymore. And because we had a character who was pregnant and in fact gives birth during the show, she and I, myself and the actress, we had quite a few little sidebars and about positions of bumps, and did it mean it was a boy if it was higher up, and all of these kind of things. And I really enjoyed that, because I often feel as a CSM we're not given that time because there's other things we have to be doing, and you kind of miss out sometimes on that unpacking. And it definitely reminded me how much I enjoy all of that side of it. So for that point, I was glad it was only me, because it was absolute luxury to be able to spend the time doing that. I still did all the paperwork. I couldn't work out what to do, what not to do, so I just decided I would do all the paperwork. So I did call sheets, I did rehearsal reports when we went into filming, and that just turned into a daily report. I just couldn't stop myself. I was like, is there a more efficient way to do this? I don't know, I'm just going to roll with this version. And that's what I did. So again, I'd be interested to hear from people who have decided to go down a different paperwork route and why they did. And like I said before, having the 2 laptops was invaluable. I would have never been able to achieved so much in the time. Everything would have taken so much longer, because I could happily have the little Zoom call just going on, and I could be typing the rehearsal report at the same time, on mute, of course, so the director couldn't hear me. But yeah, no, it was definitely. And one of the, we did music calls, we did vocal calls every morning. And the producer said to me, "Oh, why do you sit in all the vocal calls, Antonia?" But I ran all of those Zoom calls as well. But I did that for exactly the same reason that I'm saying I find it's problematic, because it was the one time I got a bit of chance to talk to the MD. And for us to have some kind of catch up as to how things were going and stuff. So I think that would be my lesson that I've learnt, is aside from the practical stuff, is make sure that you give yourself the space to mimic those catch-ups that happen naturally when we're in the same place. But I wanted to share with you a quote from my director, who said, "Creating theatre on Zoom is like wearing socks in the bath. Not necessarily wrong, but not necessarily right either."
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Stand By Please. Join us next time when we'll be discussing a stage manager's ethics. Until then, Jackie and Antonia, off cams.